Picture this. You're scrolling through an antique map from the 1702nd, and there it is sprawled across the largest landmass on Earth, a single word that makes your blood run cold. Tartaria. Not Russia, not Siberia, not China. Tartaria. A vast empire covering millions of square miles, marked with the precision of a cartographer who knew exactly what they were documenting. But here's where it gets spine-chilling. Try finding that same empire on any modern map. Try looking it up in your history textbooks. Try asking your professor about the Tartarian civilization that once dominated a third of the planet's surface. You'll find nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's as if an empire larger than Rome, bigger than the British Empire at its peak, more expansive than any nation that has ever existed, simply vanished. Not conquered, not absorbed, not gradually forgotten, completely erased, scrubbed from existence so thoroughly that mentioning it today gets you labelled a conspiracy theorist. But the maps don't lie, and what those maps reveal will shatter everything you think you know about our recent past. I'm about to take you on a journey through one of history's most haunting mysteries, the deliberate erasure of Tartaria, an advanced civilization that thrived just centuries ago, only to be wiped from our collective memory through what can only be described as the most successful cover-up in human history. Over the next hour, we're going to examine evidence that suggests our timeline isn't just wrong, it's been intentionally falsified. We'll explore architectural marvels that defy our understanding of 19th century construction capabilities. We'll investigate a global mud flood that may have buried entire cities overnight. And we'll uncover signs of free energy technology that could have powered a civilization far more advanced than we've been told. But first, let me give you a taste of just how deep this rabbit hole goes. In 1846, the Encyclopedia Britannica, the most trusted source of information in the English-speaking world, devoted 17 pages to describing Tartaria as a real place with real people, real cities, and real political structures. By 1911, that same encyclopedia had reduced Tartaria to a mere footnote, dismissing it as an archaic term for regions inhabited by nomadic tribes. What happened between 1846 and 1911? What could cause the world's most authoritative reference work to completely reverse its position on the existence of an entire empire? The answer to that question will lead us into territories that mainstream academia refuses to explore. It will force us to confront the possibility that our recent ancestors possessed knowledge and capabilities that we've somehow lost. And it will reveal a pattern of historical manipulation so vast and systematic that it challenges the very foundation of everything we've been taught about our past. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could an empire that large simply disappear from history? How could every government, every university, every institution on Earth coordinate to hide something that massive? And why would they want to? Those are exactly the right questions to ask. And by the time we're finished here, you'll have answers that will fundamentally change how you see the world around you. Let's start with the maps themselves, because they're the smoking gun that can't be explained away. From the 1502nd through the early 1800nd, virtually every major atlas produced in Europe prominently featured Tartaria. We're talking about maps created by different nations, different cartographers, different time periods, all consistently showing this massive empire spanning from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. The 1570 Ortelius Atlas, considered one of the finest achievements in Renaissance cartography, clearly delineates Tartaria as a distinct political entity. The 1626 Mercator Atlas does the same. The 1682 Vischer map, the 1720 Chatelaine Atlas, the 1762 Janvier map. I could go on for hours. These weren't crude sketches drawn by amateur explorers. These were precision instruments created by the greatest geographical minds of their era, men whose livelihoods depended on accuracy. And here's what makes this even more unsettling. These maps don't just show Tartaria as empty wilderness. They show cities. They show political boundaries. They show subdivisions like independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and Russian Tartary, suggesting a complex civilization with multiple administrative regions, trade relationships, and diplomatic structures. The level of detail is staggering. The 1692 Coronelli map shows Tartarian settlements along major rivers, mountain passes marked as trade routes, and even individual architectural features of significant buildings. This isn't the cartographic equivalent of writing "Here be dragons" on unexplored territory. This is the careful documentation of a known civilization. But then something unprecedented happens. Starting around the 1852, these references begin to disappear. Not gradually, mind you, not through the natural evolution of geographical knowledge. Suddenly and systematically, as if someone issued a global directive that Tartaria was to be erased from all future publications. The timeline of this erasure is remarkable for its precision. The 1864 Mitchell Atlas still shows Tartarian territories. The 1876 Rand McNally Atlas does not. The 1889 Times Atlas of the World makes no mention of Tartaria anywhere in its indexes. By 1900, it's as if Tartaria never existed. This pattern repeats across every major geographical publication of the era. French atlases, German atlases, British atlases, American atlases, all following the same trajectory, all erasing the same empire at roughly the same time. Now, mainstream historians will tell you this is easily explained. They'll say Tartaria was never a real empire, just a vague term Europeans used to describe the steppes of Central Asia before they had detailed knowledge of the region. They'll claim that as exploration increased and political boundaries became clearer, the archaic term simply fell out of use. But this explanation crumbles under scrutiny. If Tartaria was just a placeholder name for unknown territory, why did the maps show such specific details? Why did they depict cities, roads, political divisions, and administrative centers? Why did multiple independent sources, cartographers who had never met each other, working in different countries during different decades, all agree on the same basic geographical and political structure? More importantly, why does the archaeological evidence suggest that massive, sophisticated structures were being built across these regions during the exact time period when Tartaria supposedly existed? This brings us to one of the most compelling aspects of the Tartaria mystery, the architecture. Scattered across the former territories of the Tartarian Empire, we find buildings that shouldn't exist. Structures so advanced, so precisely engineered, so aesthetically unified, that they challenge everything we think we know about 19th century construction capabilities. I'm talking about state capitals that were allegedly built by frontier communities with populations under 10,000, opera houses in remote mining towns that rival anything in Paris or Vienna, cathedrals in the American Midwest featuring stonework that modern masons struggle to replicate even with contemporary tools. The Nebraska state capitol, completed in 1932, rises 400 feet into the sky with architectural details so intricate that each stone appears to have been carved by master craftsmen. We're told this was built during the Great Depression by a state with a population of barely 1 million people, most of whom were struggling farmers. The Salt Lake Temple, officially constructed between 1853 and 1893, features walls 6 feet thick at the base, built from granite blocks quarried 20 miles away, and somehow transported and precisely fitted without modern machinery. The official story claims this was accomplished by Mormon pioneers who had been in Utah for less than a decade. The Michigan state capitol, allegedly built in 1879, showcases a level of architectural sophistication that seems impossible for a state that had only been admitted to the Union 42 years earlier. The dome alone required engineering expertise that supposedly didn't exist in frontier America. But here's what makes this truly mysterious. These buildings don't just share individual excellence. They share a unified aesthetic. Drive across America, and you'll notice something uncanny about 19th century architecture. The same classical proportions, the same ornate details, the same massive scale, the same impossible precision. It's as if these buildings were all designed by the same civilization, following the same architectural principles, using the same advanced techniques, almost like they're remnants of a single unified empire that once spanned the continent, an empire that, according to those old maps, was called Tartaria. The architectural similarities extend far beyond America. Buildings in Russia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe from the same time period display identical characteristics, the same impossible stonework, the same unified aesthetic, the same evidence of construction techniques that supposedly hadn't been invented yet. Take the St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg, officially completed in 1858. The structure required 300,000 tons of materials, including massive granite columns, each weighing over 100 tons, somehow lifted 130 feet into the air and positioned with millimeter precision. The official story claims this was accomplished using primitive pulleys and manual labor. Or consider the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw, a massive Art Deco skyscraper completed in 1955, but designed in a style that perfectly matches Tartarian buildings from a century earlier. The continuity of architectural tradition suggests an unbroken chain of knowledge that officially doesn't exist. The pattern repeats everywhere the old maps showed Tartarian influence, unified architectural styles, impossible construction feats, buildings that seem to have been designed and built by a civilization far more advanced than the scattered frontier communities that officially constructed them. This is where the mystery deepens even further. Because if these buildings are remnants of a lost Tartarian civilization, then we need to ask, what happened to the people who built them? That question brings us face to face with one of the most disturbing aspects of this entire mystery. Because when you start digging into the official records of what happened during the mid-1800s, you discover a pattern of catastrophes so widespread and systematic that they seem almost orchestrated. Between 1850 and 1900, the territories that old maps labelled as Tartaria experienced an unprecedented series of disasters, massive fires that consumed entire cities, floods that buried settlements under layers of mud and debris, earthquakes that toppled buildings and swallowed communities whole, plagues that decimated populations with surgical precision. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the Peshtigo Fire of 1871, the Great Seattle Fire of 1889, the Johnstown Flood of 1889, the Galveston Hurricane of 1900. Each disaster perfectly timed to destroy historical records, displace populations, and create opportunities for complete rebuilding under new management. But here's what's truly chilling about these events. They weren't random natural disasters. They followed patterns that suggest deliberate targeting of specific communities, specific buildings, specific repositories of knowledge. Take the Chicago Fire as an example. Official history tells us it started when Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern in her barn, but eyewitnesses described something very different. They reported balls of fire falling from the sky, strange blue flames that couldn't be extinguished with water, fires that seemed to burn selectively, destroying some buildings while leaving others completely untouched. The aftermath is even more suspicious. Within months of the fire, construction began on a completely new Chicago. Not a rebuilt Chicago, a fundamentally different city with a completely different architectural style. The ornate classical buildings that had dominated the pre-fire landscape were replaced with simpler, more utilitarian structures. It's as if the fire provided cover for erasing one type of civilization and replacing it with another. This pattern repeats across every major disaster of the era. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake destroyed thousands of buildings, but within a decade, the city had been completely reconstructed in a modern style that bore no resemblance to what came before. Official records from before the earthquake were conveniently lost in the fires that followed. The 1900 Galveston hurricane wiped out what had been one of America's most prosperous cities, home to architectural marvels that rivaled anything in Europe. The post-hurricane reconstruction created a completely different Galveston, smaller, simpler, designed according to modern urban planning principles rather than the classical aesthetics of the original city. Each disaster followed the same script: complete destruction of existing structures, loss of historical records, displacement of original populations, and reconstruction according to new architectural and urban planning standards. But the most disturbing aspect of these disasters isn't what they destroyed, it's what they revealed. In city after city, when workers began clearing debris and digging foundations for new construction, they made discoveries that shouldn't have been possible. Buildings bury damaged buildings. Not collapsed buildings, perfectly under 10, 20, sometimes 30 feet of mud and debris. Not intact structures that had somehow been completely submerged beneath the surface. In Seattle, workers uncovered an entire underground city featuring ornate storefronts, elaborate sidewalks, and multi-story buildings with their original windows and doors still intact. The official explanation was that the city had gradually built up over time, with new streets constructed above old ones. But that doesn't explain why the buried buildings showed no signs of age or weather damage. It doesn't explain why they appeared to have been abandoned suddenly, with personal belongings still sitting on shelves and tables. And it definitely doesn't explain why the architectural style of these buried buildings was completely different from anything that supposedly existed in frontier Seattle. The underground structures weren't crude frontier buildings thrown together by pioneers. They were sophisticated architectural achievements featuring stonework, metalwork, and engineering details that matched the grandest buildings of European capitals. Similar discoveries occurred in city after city across the American Midwest and West: buried buildings in Salt Lake City, underground structures in Denver, submerged neighborhoods in Portland. Each discovery revealing the same pattern: sophisticated architecture buried beneath layers of mud and debris, as if an entire civilization had been suddenly covered over. The official explanations vary from city to city, but they all share the same weakness: they don't account for the sophistication of what was found. Frontier towns with populations of a few thousand don't build elaborate underground commercial districts. Pioneer communities don't construct multi-story buildings with ornate facades and precision stonework. Unless, of course, these weren't frontier towns at all, unless they were the remnants of something much larger and more advanced that had been deliberately buried and forgotten. This brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of the Tartaria theory: the idea that these disasters weren't natural at all, but part of a coordinated effort to erase evidence of an advanced civilization that once dominated vast territories across the globe. The evidence for this isn't just architectural, it's technological. Hidden within these buried buildings, investigators have found traces of energy systems that shouldn't have existed in the 19th century. Electrical conduits running through walls decades before Edison's power grid. Elaborate ventilation systems that maintained perfect air circulation without mechanical fans. Heating systems that provided warmth without visible fuel sources. Most intriguingly, many of these buildings feature architectural elements that seem designed to harness and distribute energy in ways we're only beginning to understand. Copper fixtures positioned at precise angles, crystal elements embedded in walls and ceilings, geometric patterns that create specific resonance frequencies when sound passes through them. The Nebraska state capitol, which I mentioned earlier, contains a series of chambers beneath the main structure that official tours don't mention. These underground rooms are lined with a material that exhibits unusual electromagnetic properties. Visitors report feeling energized after spending time in these spaces, as if the building itself is somehow generating and transmitting beneficial energy. The Salt Lake Temple features similar anomalies. The granite used in its construction contains high levels of quartz, a mineral known for its piezoelectric properties, the ability to generate electrical charge under mechanical stress. The temple's architecture seems designed to focus and amplify these natural electrical fields. Buildings across the former Tartarian territories display these same characteristics. It's as if they were designed not just as shelters or gathering places, but as components in a vast energy distribution network that once spanned continents. This technology wasn't primitive. It was elegant, efficient, and completely integrated into the architectural design. Unlike our modern approach of adding electrical systems to buildings after construction, these structures seem to have been conceived from the ground up as energy management systems. What's even more remarkable is that this technology appears to have been environmentally harmonious. No pollution, no waste products, no resource depletion. The buildings themselves seem to have been designed to work with natural energy fields rather than against them. This suggests a level of scientific understanding that we're told didn't exist until the 20th century. It implies a civilization that had solved energy problems we're still struggling with today. And it raises the most disturbing question of all. If this technology existed, and if it was so clearly superior to what replaced it, why was it abandoned? The answer to that question takes us into territory that challenges not just our understanding of history, but our understanding of how power operates in the modern world. Because if Tartaria really existed, and if it really possessed advanced technology that could provide unlimited clean energy, then someone had a very strong motivation to make sure that technology never became widely available. Someone who profited from scarcity, someone who built their power on controlling energy resources, someone who understood that free energy would fundamentally undermine the economic and political structures that kept them in control. The timeline fits perfectly. The systematic erasure of Tartaria from maps and historical records coincides exactly with the rise of industrial monopolies in energy production. The great disasters that destroyed Tartarian cities occurred just as oil and coal companies were consolidating their control over energy markets. It's as if the emergence of the modern energy economy required the complete elimination of any alternative that might threaten its dominance. And the method was brilliant in its simplicity. Don't fight the technology directly. Simply erase all evidence that it ever existed. Destroy the buildings that housed it. Eliminate the records that documented it. Replace the history books that mentioned it. Within a few generations, the memory of what was possible would fade completely. Today, we accept energy scarcity as a natural condition. We assume that power must come from burning fossil fuels or splitting atoms. We've been conditioned to believe that clean, unlimited energy is impossible a violation of physical laws. But what if that's not true? What if the evidence of another way has been systematically hidden from us? What if the ruins scattered across the landscape are trying to tell us that our ancestors achieved something we've been told is impossible? The implications are staggering. Because if Tartaria really existed, then everything we think we know about technological progress, about human capability, about the trajectory of civilization itself, needs to be reconsidered. We're not looking at the steady advance of human knowledge. We're looking at a catastrophic regression, a fall from heights we didn't even know we'd once achieved. And that regression wasn't accidental. It was engineered. The more you examine the evidence, the clearer it becomes that we're dealing with something far more sinister than natural historical evolution. We're looking at the systematic dismantling of human achievement on a scale that defies comprehension. Consider this. In 1850, The average American city featured architecture that we can barely replicate today. Buildings rose from the ground with mathematical precision that our computer-aided design systems struggle to match. Stone was cut and fitted so perfectly that you couldn't slide a razor blade between the joints. Heating, lighting, and ventilation systems operated with an efficiency that our modern buildings can't achieve even with smart technology. By 1900, that same architectural sophistication had been replaced by crude industrial construction, brick boxes designed for function rather than beauty, buildings that required constant maintenance rather than structures that seemed to maintain themselves. The regression happened so quickly and so completely that within a single generation, the knowledge of how to build like their grandfathers had been lost forever. This wasn't just happening in America. The same pattern played out across Europe, Asia, and every territory that those old maps had labelled as Tartarian. Advanced construction techniques disappeared. Architectural aesthetics simplified. Building methods devolved from sophisticated to primitive almost overnight. But here's what makes this truly extraordinary. The people responsible for this transformation didn't just erase the buildings, they erased the very concept that such buildings were possible. Think about how radical this is. Imagine if tomorrow every computer on Earth suddenly stopped working, and within 50 years, people had forgotten that computers ever existed. Imagine if all evidence of digital technology was systematically removed from libraries, museums, and educational institutions until future generations believed that electronic computation was a fantasy dreamed up by science fiction writers. That's essentially what happened to Tartarian technology. Not just the physical artifacts, but the intellectual framework that made such technology conceivable. The scope of this operation becomes clear when you examine what happened to the educational system during the same time period. Between 1850 and 1920, there was a complete overhaul of how history was taught in schools across the Western world. Curricula were standardized, textbooks were rewritten, entire historical periods were condensed, simplified, or eliminated entirely. The Prussian education model, which became the template for modern schooling, was specifically designed to produce compliant citizens rather than critical thinkers. Students were taught to memorize approved facts rather than investigate primary sources. They were trained to accept authority rather than question inconsistencies. This educational restructuring coincided perfectly with the erasure of Tartaria from historical records. By the time children who grew up under the new system became adults, they literally couldn't conceive that history might be different from what they'd been taught. The very cognitive tools needed to recognize historical manipulation had been systematically removed from their mental toolkit. The brilliance of this strategy becomes apparent when you realize that it made the cover-up self-perpetuating. Each generation that grew up without knowledge of Tartaria became incapable of recognizing evidence of its existence. They would look at a Tartarian building and see primitive frontier construction. They would examine a Tartarian map and dismiss it as geographical speculation. They would encounter Tartarian technology and classify it as impossible. The cover-up didn't require ongoing active suppression because it had reprogrammed human perception itself. But the architects of this deception made one crucial mistake. They couldn't control everything, and in their haste to erase Tartaria from official records, they left behind traces that tell a different story. These traces are scattered across multiple disciplines, hidden in plain sight within academic journals, museum archives, and government documents that most people never examine. Individually, each piece of evidence seems insignificant, but when you start connecting them, a pattern emerges that's impossible to ignore. Let's start with the linguistic evidence. The word Tartary appears in thousands of historical documents, legal contracts, trade agreements, and diplomatic correspondence spanning several centuries. These aren't vague geographical references. They're specific legal and commercial documents that treat Tartary as a legitimate political entity with defined borders, establish trade relationships, and recognize sovereignty. A 1,725 trade agreement between British merchants and Tartarian officials specifies shipping routes, cargo manifests, and payment schedules. A 1,763 French diplomatic correspondence discusses negotiations with Tartarian ambassadors over territorial disputes. And 1,804 Russian military report details conflicts along the Tartarian border, complete with troop movements and strategic assessments. These documents don't read like speculation about unknown territories. They read like routine business and diplomatic correspondence with a functioning nation-state. The level of detail, the bureaucratic precision, the casual references to Tartarian institutions and officials, it all points to a civilization that was not only real, but deeply integrated into the international community of its time. Yet mainstream historians dismiss all of this evidence as linguistic confusion. They claim that Tartary was just a catch-all term that Europeans used when they didn't understand the political structures of Central Asian nomadic tribes. This explanation becomes harder to maintain when you examine the consistency of these references across different languages, different time periods, and different types of documents. French sources, German sources, English sources, Russian sources, all describing the same political entity, using the same geographical boundaries, referencing the same institutional structures. If Tartary was just a vague European term for unknown territory, how did sources from different countries and different centuries all agree on such specific details about its political organization? The linguistic evidence becomes even more compelling when you examine the etymology of related terms. The word Tartar appears in dozens of languages across Europe and Asia, always referring to the same general population group. But here's what's interesting. In many of these languages, the word carries connotations of advanced civilization rather than primitive nomadism. Old Russian sources describe Tartarians as master builders and engineers. Medieval Persian texts praise Tartarian scholarship and scientific achievement. Even early European accounts, before the systematic rewriting of history began, describe Tartarian cities as marvels of architecture and urbans-only planning. It in post-1850 sources that Tartarians are consistently described as backward nomads. The shift in linguistic usage coincides exactly with the erasure of Tartaria from geographical records. This suggests that the redefinition of Tartar from advanced civilized people to primitive nomadic tribes was part of the same historical revision process that removed Tartaria from maps and encyclopedias. But the linguistic evidence is just the beginning. The archaeological record contains even more troubling inconsistencies. Across the territories that old maps labelled as Tartarian, archaeologists have uncovered artifacts that don't fit the official timeline. Metal objects showing signs of advanced metallurgy techniques. Pottery displaying artistic sophistication that supposedly didn't exist in those regions during those time periods. Tools and weapons that demonstrate engineering knowledge far beyond what nomadic tribes should have possessed. Most of these artifacts end up classified as anomalous finds and stored away in museum basements where they won't complicate established historical narratives. The few that make it into academic publications are explained away as imports from other regions or examples of surprisingly advanced local craftsmanship. But when you map the locations of these anomalous finds, they cluster in exactly the regions where Tartarian influence was strongest according to historical maps. The correlation is too precise to be coincidental. More telling are the artifacts that have been actively suppressed. In 1968, Soviet archaeologists excavating near the Ural Mountains uncovered what they described as a technological artifact of unknown origin featuring engineering principles that do not conform to known historical development patterns. The find was immediately classified, and all public references to the excavation were removed from academic records. Similar incidents have occurred across North America, In 1953, construction workers in Utah uncovered what appeared to be mechanical devices embedded in rock formations that were supposedly millions of years old. The artifacts were confiscated by federal authorities and never mentioned in official geological surveys of the region. In 1971, mining operations in Montana exposed what miners described as rooms carved into solid rock with walls so smooth they reflected light like mirrors. The site was sealed by government order before independent researchers could examine it. Each of these incidents follows the same pattern: discovery of artifacts or structures that contradict official historical timelines, followed by immediate suppression and removal of all evidence. The consistency of this response across different time periods and different geographical regions suggests coordinated policy rather than isolated incidents. Someone is working very hard to ensure that certain types of archaeological evidence never reach public awareness. The pattern extends beyond physical artifacts. Historical documents that reference advanced Tartarian civilization have a peculiar tendency to disappear from archives. Libraries report that books containing detailed descriptions of Tartarian technology have been misfiled or damaged beyond repair. University collections find that manuscripts discussing Tartarian political structures have been borrowed and never returned. In 1987, a researcher at the British Museum discovered a collection of 18th century letters describing trade relationships with Tartarian merchants. The letters contained detailed technical specifications for what appeared to be energy generation devices. When the researcher returned the following week to continue his analysis, he was told that the letters had been transferred to another facility for preservation. No record of this transfer exists, and the letters have never been located. Similar incidents have occurred at archives across Europe and North America. Documents that provide evidence for advanced Tartarian civilization have a remarkable tendency to vanish just as researchers begin to examine them seriously. This systematic suppression of evidence suggests that the erasure of Tartaria wasn't a historical accident. It was a deliberate campaign conducted by people with the resources and authority to manipulate academic institutions, government archives, and museum collections on a global scale. But who would have the motivation and capability to orchestrate something this massive, and why would they consider Tartarian civilization such a threat that it needed to be completely eliminated from human memory? The answer lies in understanding what Tartarian technology represented: a fundamental threat to the economic and political structures that were emerging in the 19th century. Tartarian energy systems, if they truly existed, would have made fossil fuel extraction unnecessary. Tartarian construction techniques would have eliminated the need for industrial manufacturing of building materials. Tartarian social organization, based on what fragmentary evidence suggests was a decentralized network of autonomous communities, would have made centralized government control impossible. In essence, Tartarian civilization represented everything that the emerging industrial order needed to eliminate in order to establish its dominance. The timing makes perfect sense. The systematic erasure of Tartaria from historical records coincides exactly with the rise of industrial monopolies, centralized banking systems, and modern nation-state governments. All of these institutions required scarcity and dependence to maintain their power. A civilization that had solved energy production, mastered sustainable construction, and developed effective decentralized governance posed an existential threat to the entire foundation of industrial society. The solution was elegant. Instead of trying to compete with Tartarian technology, simply erase all evidence that such technology had ever existed. Within a few generations, the very concept of free energy or sustainable architecture would seem impossible. People would accept scarcity and dependence as natural conditions rather than artificially imposed limitations. The campaign succeeded beyond its architects' wildest dreams. Today, most people literally cannot conceive that civilization might be organized differently than it currently is. They've been so thoroughly conditioned to accept the current system as inevitable that they can't recognize evidence of alternatives even when it's sitting right in front of them. But that conditioning is starting to crack, and the implications of what's emerging from behind the official story are going to reshape everything we thought we knew about human potential and the real history of our world. The evidence trail doesn't stop at suppressed documents and vanished artifacts. It extends into the very fabric of our modern infrastructure, hidden in plain sight within systems we use every day. Consider this disturbing pattern. Many of the major cities across North America and Europe that exhibit the most obvious signs of Tartarian architecture also happen to be built on top of extensive underground networks. Not sewers or subway systems constructed in the modern era, but vast tunnel complexes that predate official city founding dates by decades or centuries. In Portland, Oregon, workers routinely encounter underground chambers during construction projects. The official story attributes these to Shanghai tunnels, used for human trafficking in the late 1800s. But the architectural sophistication of these spaces, vaulted ceilings, precision stonework, advanced drainage systems, suggests something far more complex than crude criminal hideouts. The tunnel networks beneath Seattle extend far beyond the famous underground tour areas. Ground-penetrating radar surveys, when they're permitted, reveal chamber systems that span dozens of city blocks. The official explanation focuses on the regrading projects of the early 1900s, but doesn't account for why these underground spaces show signs of having been inhabited for extended periods. New York City's infrastructure reveals similar anomalies. Beneath the well-documented subway system lies another layer of tunnels that city engineers prefer not to discuss. These deeper passages feature construction techniques that don't match any known period of New York development. The stonework shows tool marks that don't correspond to equipment available during official construction periods. What makes this pattern truly unsettling is its global scope. London's underground reveals unexplained chambers beneath the Thames. Paris has tunnel networks that extend far beyond the famous catacombs. Moscow's metro system was built on top of existing underground structures that Soviet engineers never adequately explained. In each case, the official story provides superficial explanations that don't account for the sophistication of what's actually there. And in each case, access to these deeper levels is strictly controlled by authorities who seem remarkably reluctant to allow independent investigation. But the underground networks are just the beginning. The surface infrastructure of these cities reveals even more troubling patterns when you know what to look for. Take electrical systems, for example. In city after city across the former Tartarian territories, you'll find electrical infrastructure that seems oddly overbuilt for its supposed purpose. Power substations that are larger than necessary for their service areas. Transmission lines that follow routes that don't make sense from an engineering perspective. Underground electrical conduits that lead to destinations that official records don't acknowledge. Chicago's electrical grid, rebuilt after the Great Fire, includes transmission routes that bypass major population centers while serving areas with relatively low power demand. When engineers are asked about these routing decisions, they typically refer to historical considerations without providing specific details. San Francisco's post-earthquake electrical reconstruction created a power distribution network that includes substations positioned at precise geometric intervals across the city. The pattern doesn't match population density or industrial demand. Instead, it forms a geometric grid that seems designed to distribute energy according to principles that aren't taught in modern electrical engineering programs. Detroit's electrical infrastructure, built during the city's industrial boom, includes massive underground power conduits that connect buildings in patterns that don't correspond to known commercial or residential relationships. When traced on maps, these connections form geometric designs that resemble circuit diagrams more than urban utility networks. The pattern repeats in city after city. Electrical infrastructure that seems designed for purposes beyond simple power distribution. systems that exhibit characteristics of advanced energy management networks rather than crude industrial power grids. What's most intriguing is that many of these systems still function perfectly despite being decades or centuries old. The copper wiring shows no signs of degradation. The switching equipment operates with precision that modern electronics struggle to match. The overall efficiency of these networks exceeds what contemporary engineering theory suggests should be possible. It's as if these cities inherited electrical infrastructure from a civilization that understood energy distribution principles we're still trying to rediscover. The architectural evidence becomes even more compelling when you examine building foundations. Across North America, construction crews regularly encounter foundation systems that extend far deeper than necessary for structural support. These aren't simple basement structures. They're complex underground systems that seem designed for purposes beyond storage or utilities. The foundation system beneath the Nebraska state capitol extends over 100 feet underground, far deeper than required for structural stability. The underground chambers include features that don't appear on any architectural plans: metallic elements embedded in the walls, geometric patterns carved into the floor, ventilation systems that maintain perfect air circulation without mechanical assistance. Similar discoveries occur beneath state capitals across the Midwest and West. Deep foundation systems that include unexplained chambers, unusual building materials, and architectural features that don't match the official construction dates. The pattern suggests that many of these 19th century buildings were actually constructed on top of existing foundation systems that were already in place when European settlers arrived. The elaborate upper structures weren't built from scratch by frontier communities. They were additions to infrastructure that was already there, waiting to be utilized. This theory gains credibility when you examine historical accounts of early American settlement. Time and again, explorers and settlers describe finding prepared sites where construction seemed remarkably easy. Foundations that were already cleared, stone quarries that were already opened, transportation routes that were already established. The official story attributes these conveniences to natural geographical features or the work of earlier Native American populations. But Native American construction traditions, sophisticated as they were, don't match the engineering principles evident in these foundation systems. The evidence suggests that European settlers didn't build American cities from scratch. They inherited existing infrastructure from a previous civilization and modified it to suit their needs. This infrastructure inheritance theory explains many of the anomalies that plague official American history. How could frontier towns with populations under 1,000 people construct elaborate buildings that rivaled European capitals? How could isolated communities develop sophisticated urban planning principles without formal engineering training? How could scattered settlers coordinate architectural styles across thousands of miles of wilderness? The answer becomes obvious once you accept that they didn't. They were working with existing infrastructure, following design principles that were already embedded in the landscape, utilizing construction techniques that were preserved in the foundations they inherited. But if this is true, then we need to ask, who built the original infrastructure, and what happened to them? The answer to those questions takes us into territory that challenges not just American history, but our understanding of global civilization patterns. Because the infrastructure inheritance phenomenon isn't limited to North America. Similar patterns appear everywhere that old maps showed Tartarian influence. Across Russia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe, construction crews encounter the same anomalies: foundation systems that predate official building dates, underground networks that extend far beyond documented construction projects, electrical and mechanical systems that exhibit engineering sophistication beyond what historical records suggest should have been possible. The global scope of this pattern suggests something far more significant than regional historical quirks. We're looking at evidence of a worldwide infrastructure network that was already in place when the modern nation-state system emerged. This infrastructure wasn't primitive. It was advanced beyond what we've been told was possible during its supposed construction period, and it was unified in its design principles, suggesting coordination on a scale that official history claims didn't exist until the 20th century. The implications are staggering. If a unified global infrastructure network existed in the 18th and 19th centuries, then our entire understanding of technological development needs to be reconsidered. We're not looking at the gradual emergence of industrial civilization from primitive beginnings. We're looking at the inheritance and modification of advanced systems that were already functional. But here's where the story takes its most disturbing turn. Because if modern civilization inherited its infrastructure from a previous advanced culture, then the systematic erasure of that culture from historical records wasn't just about hiding technological capabilities, it was about hiding the crime. The evidence suggests that Tartarian civilization didn't simply vanish through natural historical processes, it was deliberately destroyed. And the people responsible for that destruction needed to ensure that no one would ever discover what they had done. The method was brilliant in its completeness. First, eliminate the people through a series of engineered catastrophes. Then, inherit their infrastructure, while erasing all evidence that they had ever existed. Finally, rewrite history to make the inherited achievements seem like the natural development of the inheritor's civilization. The result is a world where the victims of genocide are completely forgotten while their murderers are celebrated as great builders and innovators. The stolen infrastructure becomes proof of the thieves' ingenuity. The erased civilization's achievements become foundation myths for the societies that replaced them. This interpretation explains why the suppression of Tartarian evidence has been so systematic and thorough. It's not just about hiding advanced technology or alternative social organization. It's about hiding the greatest crime in human history, the complete elimination of a global civilization and the theft of its achievements. The perpetrators of this crime understood that if people ever discovered what had really happened, the legitimacy of every modern institution would be called into question. How can governments claim authority if they're built on stolen infrastructure? How can corporations claim ownership of resources if they're extracted from territories that were taken through genocide? How can educational institutions claim to preserve knowledge if they're actually hiding the greatest knowledge foundation of modern civilization rests on this of all, the entire massive deception? And maintaining that deception requires constant vigilance against any evidence that might expose the truth. That's why Tartarian artifacts disappear from museums. That's why historical documents vanish from archives. That's why researchers who get too close to the truth find their funding cut and their careers destroyed. The system can't afford to let this story become widely known. But the story is becoming known anyway, because the evidence is everywhere once you learn to recognize it. And more people are learning to see past the official narratives to the reality hidden underneath. The underground networks are still there, waiting to be explored. The architectural anomalies are still visible to anyone willing to look. The suppressed documents are still scattered through archives around the world, waiting for researchers brave enough to piece them together. Most importantly, the technology is still there, embedded in buildings that were designed to harness natural energy fields, preserved in architectural principles that create beneficial environmental effects, hidden in construction techniques that produce structures more durable and efficient than anything modern engineering can create. The knowledge that built Tartarian civilization hasn't been lost, it's been buried. But buried things can be excavated, hidden things can be found, suppressed technologies can be rediscovered and applied. The implications of this rediscovery extend far beyond historical curiosity. We're talking about the potential to reclaim technologies that could solve every environmental and energy problem facing modern civilization. Free energy systems that could eliminate resource scarcity, construction techniques that could create buildings that last for centuries without maintenance, social organization principles that could enable true decentralization and individual autonomy. All of this knowledge existed once. It was proven to work on a global scale, and the evidence of its effectiveness is still scattered across the landscape, hidden in plain sight within the infrastructure we use every day. The question isn't whether this technology existed. The evidence for that is overwhelming once you learn to recognize it. The question is whether we have the courage to acknowledge what the evidence means and act on its implications. Because recognizing Tartarian civilization as real means recognizing that everything we've been told about human progress, technological development, and historical inevitability is a lie. It means accepting that we're not advancing toward a more sophisticated future. We're struggling to rediscover capabilities that our recent ancestors possessed and lost. It means confronting the possibility that the last few centuries haven't been about human advancement at all. They've been about the systematic destruction of human potential in service of a control system that benefits a tiny elite at the expense of everyone else. But it also means recognizing that this control system isn't inevitable or permanent. It was created by human beings, and it can be dismantled by human beings. The technologies that once powered Tartarian civilization still exist. The knowledge that created those technologies can be recovered. The social principles that enabled decentralized prosperity can be implemented again. The Tartarian civilization that was erased from our maps and history books is trying to return through the evidence it left embedded in our world. Every anomalous building is a message. Every suppressed document is a clue. Every underground tunnel is a pathway back to capabilities we never should have lost. The choice facing us now is whether we'll have the wisdom to receive that message, follow those clues, and walk those pathways back to our true inheritance, or whether we'll continue to accept the limitations that were imposed on us by people who had every reason to keep us from discovering what we're really capable of achieving. The Tartarian mystery isn't just about the past, it's about the future. And that future is still waiting to be claimed by anyone brave enough to acknowledge that the official story of human civilization is not just wrong, but deliberately deceptive. The evidence is there, the technology is there, the knowledge is there. All that's missing is the willingness to see it, and that willingness is spreading faster than the suppression system can contain it. Because we're living in an era where information travels at light speed, where curious minds can connect across continents, where a single photograph of an anomalous building can spark investigations that span multiple disciplines and reveal patterns that were invisible just decades ago. The digital age has become the great equalizer in the battle for historical truth. While the gatekeepers of official knowledge still control universities, museums, and government archives, they can't control the collective intelligence of thousands of independent researchers armed with nothing more than curiosity and internet connections. Take what's happening with ground-penetrating radar technology. Equipment that once cost millions of dollars and required government authorization is now available to citizen scientists for the price of a used car. And they're using it to scan beneath the very buildings and locations that official archaeology has declared fully explored and understood. The results are extraordinary. In just the past 5 years, independent researchers have mapped underground chambers beneath dozens of allegedly 19th century buildings across North America. Structures that extend far deeper than any official records acknowledge. Spaces that exhibit construction techniques completely inconsistent with their supposed historical periods. The Nebraska State Capitol underground chamber system I mentioned earlier, it's not unique. Similar discoveries have been made beneath state capitals in Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, and Utah, each featuring the same impossibly precise stonework, each containing the same inexplicable energy-conducting materials, each carefully excluded from official architectural surveys. But here's what makes this truly revolutionary. The researchers making these discoveries aren't fringe conspiracy theorists. They're professional engineers, retired construction workers, university geology students, and local historians. People with the technical knowledge to recognize when something doesn't fit the official timeline, and they're documenting everything. High-resolution photographs that reveal tool marks inconsistent with 19th century equipment. spectrographic analyses showing mineral compositions that shouldn't exist in those geological formations, electromagnetic readings that demonstrate energy fields far beyond what conventional building materials should produce. The evidence is becoming impossible to dismiss through academic authority alone. When a retired civil engineer with 40 years of construction experience states that the foundation system beneath a supposedly frontier-era building required engineering knowledge that wasn't available until the 20th century, that carries weight regardless of what university professors might prefer to believe. The pattern extends beyond architecture into areas that touch every aspect of our daily lives. Transportation networks, for instance. The interstate highway system, celebrated as a triumph of 1952nd American engineering, follows routes that make perfect sense when overlaid on maps of 18th century Tartarian territories. Major highways connect cities in patterns that don't correspond to 20th century population distribution or industrial development. Instead, they link locations that old maps identified as significant Tartarian settlements. It's as if the interstate system wasn't designed to serve modern American commerce, but to connect nodes in a much older network. Railroad development follows similar patterns. The transcontinental railroads, built in the 1862nd and 1872nd, somehow managed to navigate optimal routes through mountain ranges and across vast plains without the benefit of aerial surveying or computer-assisted route planning. The engineering challenges they overcame should have been impossible with period technology, unless, of course, they weren't building new routes at all, unless they were restoring and upgrading transportation networks that already existed. Historical accounts from railroad construction crews support this theory. Time and again, workers reported finding prepared roadbeds, cleared mountain passes, and even partially constructed bridges in areas that were supposedly virgin wilderness. The official story attributes these discoveries to natural geological formations or the work of earlier Native American populations. But Native American transportation traditions, sophisticated as they were, don't explain roadbeds designed for heavy-wheeled vehicles or bridge foundations engineered to support massive loads. The evidence suggests that 19th century railroad companies didn't build America's transportation network from scratch. They inherited and modified infrastructure that was already in place, following engineering principles that had been proven effective by previous users. This infrastructure inheritance extends into systems we rarely think about but depend on every day. Water management, for instance. Cities across the American West somehow managed to develop reliable water supplies despite being built in regions with challenging hydrological conditions. Las Vegas, built in one of the most arid regions of North America, has maintained consistent water access since its founding. Phoenix, constructed in a desert environment, never faced the water crises that should have been inevitable for a settlement in that location. Denver, built on high plains with limited surface water, developed municipal water systems that functioned perfectly from the city's earliest days. The official explanations focus on the ingenuity of early settlers and their ability to locate underground water sources. But hydrological engineering at that level requires knowledge of aquifer systems, groundwater flow patterns, and sustainable extraction rates that wasn't available to frontier communities. Unless those communities inherited water management systems that were already functional and simply needed to be maintained and expanded, this theory gains credibility when you examine the actual infrastructure these cities built on. Beneath the modern water treatment plants and distribution networks lie older systems that exhibit engineering principles far advanced beyond what the official construction dates suggest should have been possible. Salt Lake City's water infrastructure, supposedly built by Mormon pioneers in the 1852nd, includes underground aqueduct systems that demonstrate hydraulic engineering knowledge that wasn't taught in American universities until decades later. The precision of the construction, the mathematical accuracy of the grade calculations, the sophisticated understanding of water pressure dynamics. All of it points to engineering expertise that the official builders supposedly didn't possess. Similar patterns appear in cities across the region. Water systems that were allegedly built by scattered frontier communities but exhibit the characteristics of coordinated regional planning. Infrastructure that supposedly developed independently but shares design principles and construction techniques across thousands of miles of territory. The coordination becomes even more apparent when you examine the electrical systems these cities developed. Not the crude early electrical networks of the Edison era, but the sophisticated power distribution systems that somehow appeared in frontier towns decades before those systems were supposedly invented. Many Western cities had functional electrical street lighting before New York or Chicago. Remote mining towns featured electrical systems more advanced than those in major Eastern industrial centers. Isolated agricultural communities somehow developed power generation capabilities that exceeded what their populations and economic bases should have been able to support. The official story attributes these achievements to local innovation and entrepreneurial spirit. But electrical engineering at that level requires knowledge of power generation, transmission efficiency, and load balancing that wasn't available through individual experimentation. The evidence points to a very different explanation. These communities inherited electrical infrastructure from a previous civilization and modified it to meet their specific needs. This infrastructure inheritance theory resolves many of the contradictions that plague official American history. How did scattered frontier communities coordinate architectural styles across vast distances? They were following design principles embedded in the infrastructure they inherited. How did isolated towns develop sophisticated urban planning without formal training? They were expanding and modifying existing urban layouts. How did small populations construct massive public buildings that rivaled European masterpieces? They were completing and decorating structures whose foundations and basic frameworks were already in place. The implications extend far beyond American history. If infrastructure inheritance occurred in North America, it likely occurred everywhere that old maps showed Tartarian influence. The rapid development of Russian cities in Siberia, the sophisticated architecture of Central Asian settlements, the advanced engineering of Eastern European transportation networks, all of it becomes comprehensible once you accept that these civilizations weren't building from scratch, but inheriting and modifying existing systems. This global pattern suggests that Tartarian civilization wasn't just advanced, it was unified in ways that official history claims weren't possible until modern times. Unified construction techniques, unified energy distribution principles, unified transportation planning, unified urban design concepts. The level of coordination this represents defies everything we've been told about pre-industrial civilization. It suggests technological capabilities, communication systems, and organizational structures that shouldn't have existed centuries before the Industrial Revolution. But the evidence for this coordination is everywhere once you learn to recognize it. In the mathematical relationships between city layouts separated by thousands of miles, in the identical proportions of buildings constructed in different continents, in the shared energy-conducting properties of structures that were supposedly built by completely independent cultures, the architectural unity is particularly striking. Measure the proportions of a state capital in Montana and compare them to a government building in Kazakhstan. Analyze the acoustic properties of a cathedral in Poland and contrast them with a civic center in Colorado. Examine the electromagnetic characteristics of a museum in Russia and relate them to a library in Utah. The similarities aren't superficial stylistic choices. They're fundamental design principles that create identical functional effects across vast geographical and cultural distances. This level of consistency doesn't develop through coincidence or cultural diffusion. It emerges from shared knowledge systems, unified educational traditions, and coordinated implementation of proven techniques. In other words, it's evidence of a civilization that was far more integrated and technologically sophisticated than anything in official history. And that civilization left behind more than just buildings and infrastructure. It left behind knowledge systems that are still accessible to anyone willing to look for them. The knowledge isn't hidden in secret libraries or locked away in government vaults. It's embedded in the structures themselves, waiting to be decoded by people with the technical background to understand what they're seeing. Every Tartarian building is essentially a textbook written in stone and metal. The proportional relationships encode mathematical principles. The material choices demonstrate advanced understanding of physics and chemistry. The construction techniques preserve engineering knowledge that modern practitioners are still trying to rediscover. The challenge isn't finding this information, it's developing the literacy to read it. And that literacy is spreading. Engineering students are beginning to recognize that historical buildings exhibit capabilities their textbooks claim shouldn't be possible. Physics researchers are discovering that certain architectural configurations create energy effects that conventional theory doesn't predict. Materials scientists are finding that traditional construction materials exhibit properties that modern manufacturing can't replicate. Each of these discoveries represents a crack in the official narrative, a piece of evidence that conventional history can't explain away through appeals to authority or accusations of pseudoscience. The academic establishment is beginning to face a crisis of credibility. Too many anomalies are accumulating. Too many independent researchers are asking uncomfortable questions. Too many professionals with relevant expertise are pointing out inconsistencies that can't be dismissed through ridicule or suppression. The response has been predictable but increasingly ineffective. Journals refuse to publish papers that challenge established timelines. Grant funding disappears for research projects that might uncover inconvenient evidence. Academic careers are derailed for scholars who ask the wrong questions. But the suppression system that worked so effectively in the pre-internet era is breaking down in the face of distributed information networks. When evidence can be shared instantly across global communication systems, when researchers can collaborate without institutional oversight, when documentation can be preserved in multiple locations simultaneously, traditional gatekeeping mechanisms lose their effectiveness. The Tartarian mystery is becoming a case study in how historical truth emerges despite systematic suppression efforts. The evidence is too widespread, too consistent, and too well documented to be contained through conventional academic control mechanisms. More importantly, the implications of that evidence are too significant to be ignored by people who care about human potential and technological possibility. Because if Tartarian civilization really existed, and if it really possessed the advanced capabilities that the evidence suggests, then we're not just looking at interesting historical trivia. We're looking at proof that sustainable, abundant, decentralized civilization is not only possible, but has actually been achieved on a global scale. The technologies that powered Tartarian society, free energy systems, sustainable architecture, efficient transportation networks, effective resource management represent solutions to every major challenge facing modern civilization. Climate change becomes manageable when energy systems don't produce pollution. Resource depletion becomes irrelevant when construction techniques create durable infrastructure. Economic inequality becomes unnecessary when energy and materials are abundant rather than scarce. The social organization principles that enabled Tartarian civilization to flourish across vast territories without centralized control offer alternatives to the increasingly dysfunctional governance systems that dominate the modern world. Decentralized decision-making that somehow maintained coordination across continental distances. Economic systems that created prosperity without exploitation. Cultural traditions that preserved knowledge while encouraging innovation. All of this existed once. It worked on a scale that dwarfs any modern civilization, and the evidence of its effectiveness is still visible to anyone willing to look beyond the official story of human development. The question facing us isn't whether we can rediscover these capabilities. The question is whether we'll have the courage to challenge the systems that benefit from keeping us ignorant of our true potential. because the same forces that erased Tartarian civilization from historical records are still operating today. They still profit from scarcity and dependence. They still require centralized control to maintain their power. They still need people to believe that the current system is the best humanity can achieve. Rediscovering Tartarian knowledge threatens all of that, which is why the suppression continues, even as the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. But suppression only works when people accept it. And more people every day are refusing to accept limitations that were artificially imposed on them by others who had every reason to keep them from discovering what they're truly capable of achieving. The Tartarian Renaissance has already begun, not in universities or government institutions, but in garages and workshops where independent researchers are experimenting with energy systems that conventional physics claims are impossible. In community gardens where people are rediscovering agricultural techniques that create abundance without environmental destruction. In alternative building projects where traditional construction methods are producing structures more durable and efficient than anything modern engineering can create. These aren't fringe movements anymore. They're growing networks of people who understand that the official story of human limitation is not just wrong, but actively harmful to human flourishing. The knowledge is spreading. The evidence is accumulating. The suppression system is failing. And somewhere, in the ruins of a forgotten empire, the architectural remnants of an advanced civilization are still humming with energy, still demonstrating possibilities, still waiting for their children to come home. The technology isn't just hiding in forgotten buildings or buried beneath modern cities. It's operating right now, in ways that most people never notice or think to question. Walk through any major city at night and look up at the streetlights. Notice how they create perfect pools of illumination with virtually no light pollution bleeding into surrounding areas. That level of optical precision requires engineering knowledge that supposedly wasn't available when most urban lighting systems were installed. Drive down any major highway and pay attention to how smoothly the road surface handles water drainage. Even during heavy storms, water flows away from the roadway with an efficiency that suggests understanding of fluid dynamics far beyond what road construction crews should have possessed when these systems were built. Enter any large public building constructed before 1920 and notice the acoustic properties. Voices carry with supernatural clarity across vast interior spaces. Sound doesn't echo or distort the way it should in structures built with conventional construction techniques. The acoustic engineering embedded in these buildings demonstrates principles that weren't supposed to be understood until modern times. These aren't accidents or lucky guesses. They're the result of applied knowledge that someone possessed and implemented on a massive scale across multiple continents during a time period when such knowledge supposedly didn't exist. The evidence surrounds us every day, embedded in the very infrastructure that supports our modern world. Every anomalous building is a whisper from a civilization that refused to stay buried. Every suppressed document is a breadcrumb leading us back to capabilities we never should have lost. Every underground chamber is proof that the official story of human progress is nothing more than an elaborate lie designed to keep us from remembering what we're truly capable of achieving. The choice is yours. You can continue accepting the limitations that were imposed on you by people who profited from your ignorance. Or you can start asking the questions that terrify those in power. What else have they hidden from us? What other technologies have been suppressed? What other possibilities have been erased from our collective memory? The Tartarian Empire may have been wiped from our maps and history books, but its legacy lives on in every impossible building, every mysterious foundation, every energy field that shouldn't exist according to modern science. The technology is still there, waiting to be rediscovered. The knowledge is still embedded in stone and metal, waiting to be decoded. All that's missing is the courage to see it. And that courage is spreading faster than they can contain it.